Within the 2,500 feet altitude of the Brushy Mountains, it was a cool, invigorating place. The atmosphere was said to help with insomnia, breathing problems, and poor appetite. The water had 35/100ths of lithia that was advantageous. George B. Hanna on October 4, 1892 stated, "I judge from the analysis, the general appearance, etc., that your water will be very valuable and beneficial." Dr. C.C. Hubbard from Worthville, North Carolina, in 1893 recommended Lithia Springs when medical treatment failed. The curative powers of the springs were said to improve such afflictions as stomach, liver, kidney, and bladder troubles, malaria, asthma, hay fever, and rheumatism. Claims were also made that the waters would restore lost vitality and were very effective on women's diseases. Meadows Mill Company began in 1900 at Poor's Knob. Reverend William Callaway Meadows designed and built a burr mill.
My great-grandfather, W.C. Meadows, was an inventor and started the Meadows Mill Company.
He obtained a patent from Washington, D.C. the same year he received a gold medal in the Jamestown Exposition.
This was an iron frame. The original W.C. Meadows Mill was a wood frame or square frame mill. And this was a cast iron frame mill that had interlocking holes that was very secure when this mill was set up. It stayed in alignment all better than the wood ever did.
In 1908, a group of North Wilkesboro men bought Reverend Meadows' interest. In 1918, the Meadows Mill Company, owned by Edward G. Finley, C. L. Sockwell, and Richard G. Finley, was located on 5th Street, where Arthur Lowe's Hayden Metal is today.
It was a very strong company, occupying a building on Main Street, a building on Cherry Street, building on 5th Street, and then the headquarters was at the corner of C and 5th, right across the street from the Opera House. And of course, as we all know, the Opera House burned in a few later years, and Meadows burned along with it. Finally, and I'm not sure just exactly when, but sometime along about 1930, they consolidated into what we know as the FCX building on Main Street in North Wilkesboro, and the Hamby Concrete building, which was right behind it. That building's been, well, both those buildings have been torn down, but that's where the consolidations took place, and they stayed in those two buildings until the building on West D Street was built in 1965.
It manufactured grist mills, hammer mills, saw mills, and good saws. The mill was later sold to Bob and June Heggie. In 1897, Professor T.J. Gilreath was principal of a 10-month school at Goshen. The school was referred to by the Chronicle on June 11, 1896, as the Lebanon High School, a subscription school. Today there is a church and fire department at Goshen. On July 15, 1916, the Yadkin River watershed was deluged with a great downpour of rain which caused the Yadkin River to rise 9 feet higher than the previous high water mark. Landslides, bridge washouts, and mass flooding occurred. The small growing industrial towns of Wilkesboro and North Wilkesboro were hit hardest, with numerous buildings, homes, and businesses either destroyed or washed away. The railroad bed of the Southern Railway followed the Yadkin River for 40 miles and was completely washed out. On August 13th and 14th, 1940, the next great flood rolled down the Yadkin River and again shattered the lives and livelihoods of those in its path. The river surged to a level 4 feet higher than recorded during the 1916 flood, and damage was great.
I remember my grandmother, Laws. They had their house on a creek, and she was bedfast, and she became very afraid of water, and so she had my grandfather to build another house higher up on the hill so the water wouldn't get up in her house, you know, like if it happened again. And so she was very afraid of water. And we probably went with a gentleman to Wilkesboro in like a ton farm truck. And so we stopped in Wilkesboro, and you could look across the town, and the water covered part of the town. It was up in some of the service stations. You could see them. It was up high, almost to the bridge, and you could see a lot of debris coming down the river. And it was everything from parts of houses to big trees and everything else coming down the river.
Loss of life was accompanied by massive property damage and a total disruption of the local economy.
The 40 flood, it affected everything. You could go to North Wilkesboro. I remember Daddy had taken us down there. People from around here, you had John Irving's barn off down there in the bottom right there before you get it midway to the left. And I can remember when we went down there, we were on the hill. There's a goat up in the attic of that, in the loft of that barn. I don't know what happened to it, but you could look over there and all you could see was the lights off of the old bridge, those posts sticking up. They was nearly covered with water. That is the 1940 flood.
Over 150 homes were washed away, factories burned to the ground, and over $5 million of damage by 1940 standards occurred.
Little Moravian Creek flooded because there was a large recreation lake up the road from it, the richest lake. You remember it? It's not there anymore. But the dam broke at the lake, and it came right down the highway and washed probably 3/4 of a mile of Highway 16 off, and washed away the mill. Now, we were living at my grandmother's house at that time, and there was a fairly steep bank, steeper than that, up from the road, but it came all the way up the highway. We could see it lapping down there, and my grandmother was really worried about her barn and the pig pen. The creek got up into them. There was water about so far, but it didn't drown anything. They managed to kick it out. But it washed the mill away, and it got stuck under the bridge, and that's why it flooded back up our way.
Following this disaster, the local residents began to seek help from the problems of flooding on the Yadkin River. Following a strong push for support among the public and through congressional approval, the project for the improvement of the Yadkin Pee Dee River was authorized by the Flood Control Act of 1946. After some modification based on studies in the period 1953 to 1959, the project was funded for construction in fiscal year 1960 due to the devastating floods of 1899, 1916, and 1940. Construction of the project took place between 1960 and 1962. The project was opened to the public in 1963 and was named for William Carr Scott, former governor of North Carolina and U.S. Senator, who greatly assisted in obtaining approval for construction of the dam and reservoir. Authorized purposes of the reservoir are flood control, water supply, recreation, and management of the natural and cultural resources. The entire reservoir is open for public use and recreation. The project also has ample fishing opportunities. Fishing is popular among both bass enthusiasts and those merely fishing for fun. Through fisheries management, increased access to fishing opportunities, and recent successful trends, the future of sports fishing is brighter. Boomer is a small farming community settled by the whites before the Revolutionary War. It's in the southwest part of Wilkes County and 10 miles from Wilkesboro. Boomer was the birthplace of John Crouch, who wrote the first history of Wilkes County when he was very young. Paul Crouch was also a Wilkes County native with connections to the U.S. Communist Party. He was a key witness against the Communist Party to the U.S. Senate. The first Boomer school was built of logs on the J.M. German farm. The next building was near the Boomer post office. It ranked with the best and functioned for several years. On January the 8th, 1904, the school building was destroyed by fire. Professor Bolden led the community to vote in the first local tax in Wilkes County. This, with donations by the residents of the district, was used to erect a new building. It was built on the River Road opposite the Advent Christian Church.
Talking about Boomer and how it's got its name, and we referenced that it came from a squirrel called a Boomer squirrel. But several years ago, I guess back in the early 80s, there's kind of a prank on one of the local radio stations that there was a winery. Was it Heine Winery? Heine Winery in Boomer, North Carolina. And you would not believe the number of people that started coming up to Boomer looking for this winery. Well, the locals, this is on like a rock station, so the locals up there probably hadn't heard this. They didn't know what in the world they were talking about, you know. And it's all just a big prank. But this was a radio station that broadcasted, pretty much across this part of the state. So they would go up to Lackey's Market, which is a little local market up there in Boomer, and say, well, we're here looking for the winery, and everybody looked at them like they were foolish. What are you talking about? We don't have a winery. There may have been a winery, but nobody knew about it. It might have been somebody making their own brew, but it certainly wasn't a winery. So, and then shirts started coming out. People started wearing T-shirts. Always entrepreneurial spirit around somewhere. So people started making Heine Winery T-shirts, Boomer, North Carolina. Oh, I remember that made my grandma so mad. My great grandma Nell. She was strong Baptist, or just to think that somebody's associating Boomer with wine just burnt her up.
Thankful Baptist Church formed in 1869 when nearby Zion Hill Baptist Church, established in 1814, granted letters of dismissal to 17 black members who founded Thankful. F. Lee Howe has records showing that the Boomer School for Coloreds, as it was called, was established in October 1916. The school was in 2 locations, the first one near the cemetery of Thankful Baptist Church, and the second one was near Piney Grove Baptist Church, which is closer to Moravian Falls. Thankful School opened about the same time the older school closed around 1950. Thankful School closed in 1966, and in 1967 the people of the community purchased this school from the Wilkes County Board of Education. In 2003, renovations began on the old Thankful School building with plans to place a community center and a children's activity center in the building. The location would also serve as a place for the elderly to gather and engage in community activities. The community center had its grand opening in April of 2005. Lackey's Market in Boomer has been a place of congregating for decades. Ed and Ella Mae Lackey traded Doc Caudill for the store and house. Caudill, in turn, got their house a short distance up the road. It's unclear when Caudill first built the building, which had been a popular watering hole, but the trade was made sometime in the 1930s. Fort Hamby is now listed on both sides of the Yadkin River and Carscott Lake. A road marker is on Highway 268. The park is on the 421 side. A band of Union deserters terrified Wilkes County at the end of the Civil War. It was one of the most exciting chapters in Wilkes County and northwestern North Carolina history. Today there is lush scenery for the Forest Edge Amphitheater that is nestled into a setting of large mature white pines. The theater was built using $350,000 from the Army Corps of Engineers and over $400,000 from private grants and donations. The Wilkes Playmakers will be using it for the production of Tom Dooley, a Wilkes County legend made popular by the Kingston Trio. In January 1866, Wilkes County experienced another criminal event. Laura Foster disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The news spread like wildfire throughout Wilkes County, and a number of circumstances pointed to her murder. 3 or 4 young men, including Tom Dooley, who were known to have kept company with Laura, left the county and were later found in Tennessee. A group of Wilkes men went there and brought Tom back. Evidence was found indicating that Dooley, who had been a musician in the Confederate Army, was in love with Laura Foster and Ann Melton, a married lady. Declarations which Ann made indicated she had a hand in the murder. She and Dooley had been together the day before, and Dooley borrowed a mattock, supposedly to dig the grave. The grand jury at Wilkesboro in May 1866 indicted Dooley as principal and Ann Melton as an accessory in the murder of Laura Foster. Governor Zebulon B. Vance represented the defendants. The case was lost, and Tom was sentenced to be hanged. On the gallows, Tom stated, "Gentlemen, do you see this hand? I didn't harm a hair on the girl's head." Tom was hanged and his body brought back to his home overlooking the Yadkin River. The ballad was written by a local poet, Thomas C. Land, around the time of the hanging. It was very popular among the mountain people. In 1958, it was revived and made popular worldwide by the Kingston Trio. Tom Dooley's grave is on private property and is not open to the public. The Tom Dooley Museum is located in Ferguson, North Carolina, at the Whippoorwill Academy and Village, and is open to the public. The Old Wilkes Jail was where Tom was held until his trial.